Hello, hello, everyone, and thank you for coming back with another OWASP Nova meetup. We have Steve Springett here to talk about DependencyTrack, and I just want to do very, very short housekeeping. We are going to have a slight delay in the next month's meetup, just simply because of tax day. We decided to push it back, so it's expected to come out on April 22nd. But just, keep posted to the Twitter feed and the meetup emails themselves. But that's all we have from our side. So I just like to pass it right off to Steve Spriggan and let him take it away on his fantastic supply chain work and then the wonderful tool DependencyTrack. So
Great. Thanks, Ben. Thank you, OWASP Nova, for having me. For this talk is going to be interesting. This is actually built on a lot of my previous work. If you've seen some of my other talks before, there's some new material in here. So this is going to be exciting. So a little bit about me before we dive into it. I'm the creator of the OWASP Dependency-Track project. It's a flagship OWASP project used in a lot of different organizations to, you know, identify risky components and other things. I'm the creator and the current lead of the Cyclone DX core working group. Cyclone DX is a software bill of materials standard, an open source one that is security focused, and it comes out of the work that we've done at OWASP. I'm the current leader and one of the co-authors of the OWASP software component verification standard. This is a documentation OWASP project. It's an incubator at the moment. I think it's up for evaluation. But this is really looking at the maturity, the assurance of your software supply chain, everything from your inventory to, yes, software bill of materials, but your build system and your downstream suppliers. So really looking about the assurance of your build system, which that's never in the news anymore, is it? So it's a lightweight standard similar to ASVS. Take a look at it. Highly encourage. I'm one of the contributors to the package URL specification. Real brief. Every ecosystem decides to name their things differently with different conventions. Maven has govs. NPM has optional scopes with names and versions, and every ecosystem does something different, which is silly and kind of a waste of time. So package URL is a open source standard to unify that into a common way of representing that component, regardless of what ecosystem it's part of. And I do a lot of other software supply chain stuff with various working groups, especially in the US government. What I actually get paid to do is software security leadership at ServiceNow. So a little bit of background about the OWASP Dependency-Track project. It's again, it's a flagship OWASP project. It was actually started in 2013, but it's been around for a while, and the original use cases are still there. It's highly mature. Tens and tens of thousands of organizations are using this. Everything from financial services to manufacturers to medical device makers, consumer electronics companies, governments. So it's definitely in use. There's a large community of contributors and adopters, which I'm really thankful for. And finally, it is open source. What is it? Well, it's based around the concept of software bill of materials, or SBOMs. An analogy of an SBOM is a list of ingredients, right? This is ingredients for an energy bar. And the idea for this is that we can pull out at the bottom here something that might be risky to me. You know, if you have a similar allergy like peanuts or something similar, this is a way for you to perform a lightweight threat model of your energy bar. Software bill of materials is kind of looking for this. Does it have struts? Because if it does, I might not want it. A better analogy that I like to use is something like an automobile dashboard, right? The dashboard, the interior of a car has a dashboard assembly, and within the dashboard, you're going to have an instrument cluster, and within that instrument cluster, you're going to have like a speedometer, for example, which might contain LEDs and resistors and capacitors and whatnot. So that's kind of the analogy that I like to use, because all of these different components could come from different suppliers, and they are included within other things, and those other things are then included in bigger things. And that's kind of how software is created and distributed today. So there's really, well, technically there's 3 formats, but there's really 2 viable formats. And that's Cyclone DX, which again, I lead that core working group. It's security focused. It comes out a lot of the work that myself and some others have done out of OWASP. And then there's the SPDX standard from the Linux Foundation. That specific standard has a more license and intellectual property use case because that's their background. Security was something that was bolted on. And I know there's some efforts to improve that. But right now, CycloneDX is the preferred format, at least for security use cases. So SBOMs are in the news a lot lately, right? Initially, I thought, and this is going back a few years actually, initially I thought that it was really kind of a reaction to breach fatigue, right? Constantly components were being hacked, and large enterprises, remember Equifax, were getting popped, and a lot of it came down to, in many cases, the use of these third-party components and the lack of knowing where in their environment things were actually running. So I think a lot of the SBOM things that are in the news today is really around that kind of fatigue, right? It's constantly in the news. SolarWinds being the latest in a software supply chain to make that kind of press. But there's other contributing factors, right? You've got compliance, you've got regulators, the FDA and others. You know, there's economic and market forces. For example, you know, financial services, even my organization, we're doing this for procurement, right? If a vendor can't actually produce a software bill of material, well, I'm going to ask, well, I might, first of all, I may not even buy it. And second of all, if I do, I'm going to ask for a substantial discount because now I know that they have a less mature organization than I have. So that means I have to do some of their work for them. So yeah, I'm gonna give a discount. But there's other use cases that it's interesting when you start doing research in various different ways. You anticipate the kind of use cases that things are going to be used for, and forensics was not on my radar. But yeah, you kind of have to know what software was in play at any given time when you are investigating an incident, for example. So what does DependencyTrack do? It consumes, analyzes, and produces software bill of materials at high velocity, which makes it ideal for use in modern build pipelines. But the original use cases are still there. The original use cases were actually manual. So I have this component and I'm going to enter that information, or I actually have an SBOM and that I got from procurement or M&A, and I'm going to upload that to DependencyTrack. So that use case is still supported, and we're actually going to demo that use case today. DependencyTrack can quickly answer what is affected and where. So typical enterprise, you might have tens of thousands of applications in your environment, and we'll pick on struts because it's easy to pick on. But what applications in your environment, out of your tens of thousands of ones deployed, do you know which ones are running struts? And do you know the affected versions of the ones that are running struts? DependencyTrack can actually tell you that. So conceptually, this is what DependencyTrack does. You have an asset. It could be anything from an IoT device to a microservice to a monolithic application. You have an asset, and then you have a bill of material that describes the inventory for that asset, and then you analyze it, right? You ingest it into DependencyTrack, and you're happy. This is what it actually does. Stepping up to more of a 1,000-foot view. You first start off with the production of a software bill of materials, CycloneDX being the recommended format, but SPDX is also supported. You produce it in your build pipeline, and this is really elementary to do. And then you ingest it into DependencyTrack. You can, like I said, you can manually upload it if you want to, but most organizations choose automation, so you can use Jenkins plugins. There's GitHub Actions to do this. You can use curl or whatever to upload it to DependencyTrack. And then once it's in DependencyTrack will then analyze that for known risk. It supports license, operational risk, which is like allowed list, denied list of components, for example, and then of course security risk. For all the components in your portfolio within DependencyTrack, DependencyTrack is going to continuously monitor these things. So every 24 hours at a minimum, it's going to be continuously analyzing everything in its portfolio for various forms of risk. And when it identifies risk, it's going to tell you about it, right? And there's a bunch of webhooks and some other things that we kind of deliver so that you can take action on it, right? Because keeping information inside of DependencyTrack is kind of meaningless, right? You need to, one, know about it, and two, perform some kind of action on it. And the webhooks that we actually provide you give you enough information about what was affected and where in your environment it was affected at, so that you can make some kind of response. So let's dive into a very quick demo of DependencyTrack to kind of see how it works. Let me stop sharing this and share my browser real quick. And Firefox. Okay. Okay, so this is the very first thing that you will see when you log into DependencyTrack. So we keep a portfolio view of your risk. So the number of vulnerabilities over time, we have a kind of a risk calculation that is over time, the number of vulnerable components over time, and we have a inherited risk score as well that we calculate. And we have some other metrics on here if you want to play with those. But everything starts off with a project. And a project is just, it could be an operating system, it could be an application or a microservice, it could be an IoT device, whatever the case is. Let me actually just choose one that I know is already done. Let's go into here and see what's in here. Actually, yeah. So this has got 158 components in it. And it tells me, looks like this is a .NET project, and it tells me the inventory of all of the components here. And it looks like this one right here, this is an older version of Angular. It tells me that it's, at least for this series, it's out of date, right? And then of course it tells me the number of critical high, medium, and low. So I've got some vulnerabilities on this particular component. So then I can dive into that particular component and see exactly what vulnerabilities are in there. Looks like all of these vulnerabilities were identified by OSS index. So unfortunately, they don't have a very human-readable naming convention, unlike the NVD. But DependencyTrack is very agnostic to the forms of vulnerability intelligence. It actually supports the NVD. It supports NPM advisories. It supports OSS index from Sonatype, and it supports VulnDB from risk-based security. As an OWASP project, we're very agnostic, and we are going to continue to expand the number of freely available sources as well as commercial sources. In fact, there's a couple commercial sources there that we're already working towards. So let me go back to projects here and choose. Let me actually want to delete this one here. Let's start a new project. Let's say I've got I don't know, maybe an IoT toaster, right? Because what can possibly go wrong with an IoT toaster? And this is a device. So again, normally this would be through automation, but in this case, I'm just going to upload the bill of material that I've already prepared. But normally this would be done through automation, your Jenkins plugin or whatever. And it's a very small project. So I've got 3 different components in this project. It tells me the inventory. But this is brand new. It not only tells me like the software inventory of these things, and there's 3 different components here. There's looks like a common utility framework. There's a persistence framework probably for a database, and I have a web framework here. But like a lot of applications, I rely on some kind of service, right? It's very unusual, I guess, to find an application that is self-contained, I guess, that doesn't talk to the outside world. Most bill of material standards don't actually support anything other than software, which is one of the reasons why CycloneDX is kind of unique in this aspect. So you guys are actually seeing this for the very first time. This feature was released literally yesterday. So this is a first. So we support services as well. It's quite common for example, you might have a component in your inventory where maybe it is merely a wrapper around something else. Maybe it's a wrapper around Google Maps, for example, or some kind of stock ticker service, as the case is here. But that essentially becomes part of your inventory, right? That's, you know, it's really a matter of serialization, actually. Instead of it being a local function call, it's essentially a remote function call. And DependencyTrack doesn't really care whether or not it's local or remote. And the remote aspect, the services aspect, was just released yesterday. So here it actually tells me like the name of the service provider and if I have a version or whatnot of that. It gives me information about that provider, so I know how to contact that provider. It tells me the various endpoints that my application actually talks to, right? And for those endpoints, it actually tells me like the data classification and what direction it's going. This is huge. I mean, this is not being done today. Imagine doing this with a software composition analysis tool. They can't do it. So there's certain advantages to an SBOM based approach. This just happens to be one of them. And of course, there's external references. So, you know, in this case, it looks like I've got the website for this particular vendor, and I've got the Swagger definitions. So anyway, not only does it have a list of the components for my toaster, but it has, for some reason, my toaster is giving me stock ticker advice. So beware of this toaster. Also new as of yesterday, so again, you're seeing this for the very first time, is interactive dependency graphs. And this can get as simple as or complex as you like. This is a very simple case because I only have 3 components. At the top is my toaster. And it looks like I've got a couple dependencies here, or direct dependencies anyway. And my web framework relies on this common util class. And it looks like my persistence framework also relies on that same common util class. So anyway, this is an interactive dependency graph. But it's interesting because if you go back to that original analogy, the automotive dashboard analogy from earlier, there's other ways to view this types of information. So a future version of DependencyTrack will have not only this way to view your dependency graphs, but it's going to have a more it's going to have different ways to view your dependency information that I'm really excited about. One of the enhancements that we're going to be doing is actually around the services. How does the use of services come into your actual dependency graph, and how do you visualize that, right? So that's some areas that we're going to be diving deep on in a future version. Let me go back to another project here and show you a few other things. When I do have a project that does have vulnerabilities, for example, you'll have a list of those vulnerabilities here, and you can go down into each vulnerability and make audit decisions, right? If I know, for example, that maybe this is not actually being used, maybe my Axios is maybe limited to my unit testing, or maybe I'm not actually using this particular function of Axios, I can actually make that audit decision here. Function not in use, I can add the comment and set it to not affected, and I can optionally suppress that. I would not recommend it in this particular case, but if something is truly like a false positive and you never want it to show up again, you would want to suppress it. If you're used to, if you've ever worked with like Fortify, it's very, very similar to the way Fortify works. And then we also have policy violations. Looks like this project doesn't have any violations. I think, let's see if this project has any violations. Yeah, this project actually has a violation. This one has a license violation, actually. So this particular component right here, this PM2 component, it looks like, oh yeah, it's an AGPL license. So I know my legal team, for example, is kind of allergic to AGPL. So this would actually fail or in this case, it's a warning, but you can set the violations that you want. When we were saying that, you know, you can identify what is affected and where. This is kind of the where. So that PM2 component, for example, let's just try to search for it, right? PM2, I found it. It's available in this particular project, right? So if you have software bill of materials for your projects in your enterprise, you can quickly identify where components are actually being used. And you can identify it by coordinates. You can identify it by package URL, for example. If you've got CPEs, you can identify it by those. You can also identify it by hashes if you want. And there's other ways to identify it that are coming in the future. So for example, if you know that a malicious version of, let's just say, of the Axios library, you know that the version on NPM by the original maintainer is good, but maybe there's a forged version of Axios that has a spelling mistake that has a different hash, right? And you want to search for that hash in your environment. You can do that, right? You can do that because you have the inventory and you have a centralized portfolio where you're tracking and being able to search on that inventory. Let's see. You can go through it the other way too. So for example, if I'm looking for, oh, I don't have a good example right now, but if you 2021 something or other, say for example, I care about this particular vulnerability because maybe it's got a shiny new logo and it's in the press, right? I can see what projects in my organization are actually affected by this particular vulnerability. This one, I don't have any, but you kind of get the idea. So you can go to it from the opposite perspective if you want. In terms of like license, or I'm sorry, in terms of like policy management, I've got one policy defined, and that's probably the prohibited licenses. So I've got a one condition, for example, that's set where anything that's in the copy left category is going to trigger this policy violation. Now I can go over here to copy left and see exactly what licenses that's going to trigger on. This all comes out of the box when you install DependencyTrack, and of course you can change it, right? So if you don't want to use what DependencyTrack gives you and you want to use something completely different, great, you can do that as well. But there's all kinds of different types of policies that you can create. Oops, let's do a pro. Okay, so this is my prohibited components lists. So for example, I could do a condition for this that says anything that had a coordinate with org Apache struts, then I am going to fail. So that's my condition. So anything that has, what happened to my condition? Oh, maybe I went away too quick. Anything that has the, matches, I forgot that. Org Apache struts saved. Okay, so any condition matching this then would actually fail the policy, and you can get notification of that. Again, we support a number of different repositories. So when we're looking at out-of-date components, for example, anything from Cargo to Gems to Maven to Hex to NPM and PyPI, we support out of the box. Not only the default repos for each ecosystem, but in many cases, like for example Maven, we also support some very popular alternative repositories as well, because not everything revolves around Maven Central. And we also integrate with some other services. We have native integration with Fortify Software Security Center. We have native integration as of the last release, I think, with Defect Dojo, which is fantastic. And for the enterprises, we've got defect or integration with Kenna Security that I'm really excited about too. So let's go back to the slides real quick. And
here, sorry, now that we have a chance to transition, there's a couple of questions hanging in there.
Great.
So I want to roll through with them. So first of all, what types of formats are you able to export the SBOM list with, or are there different options, or what would a user be looking at?
Yeah, so once SBOMs have been ingested into DependencyTrack, they can, not the SBOM itself, because once it's sent to DependencyTrack, it's processed and discarded. However, you can dynamically generate a CycloneDX 1.2 SBOM for any project in the portfolio, which means that if you are manually updating components, or if you are ingesting SPDX documents, for example, you can automatically generate CycloneDX 1.2 from any project in DependencyTrack. There is an enhancement request to make the storage of all the SBOMs that have been uploaded to any project, to make that persistent and to have a configurable retention policy. So that is something that the project is going to be taking on. So did I mention it's open source and pull requests are appreciated?
Sure. And then how widespread is DependencyTrack's usage? So is this a lot of organizations? Is this like a couple of startups using it, or what kind of environment would the ideal user be? Enterprise user?
Wow, that's it's really interesting when you build software and it matures to this point. The types of organizations using it. I'm not going to name names, but
Right.
I can tell you that it's used in financial services. It's used in large manufacturers like OEM manufacturers. It's used in consumer electronics things, very brand name things that we all use every day. Okay. It's used in One of the misuse cases I actually ran across recently is it's actually used not only for medical devices, right, which have their own bill of materials, and that's great. It's actually used to track the actual devices implanted in patients themselves. Um, Not what this was intended for, but it's
Seems
being
like a
used
few
that way
PII
because
violations
nothing
there.
really exists in the market to do that. The project has over 1 million Docker pulls today. So there's literally tens of thousands of organizations having this in production today.
Great. Yeah, that answers those questions. And then the last one looks like, so how does the alerting feature work? Is it able to integrate with other services, SMS maybe, or anything like that? Or what
Not
kind?
SMS, but
What
yeah,
kind of other downstream
obviously,
processes?
obviously email, but yeah, Slack and Microsoft Teams, and then of course webhooks. So by default, everything is going to be a webhook. So, but if you want to get chat, notification via chat, you can do that as well. Um, However, if you want to take action, and like for example, in the case of Apache struts or something like that, yeah, it's nice to get notified of something, but more than that, you typically want to take some kind of action on that thing, right? So we give you the webhook, and we provide a lot of details in our webhooks on purpose because we want you to make some kind of informed decision automatically based on the information that we give you. So webhook is your friend if you're good for automation.
All right. Yeah, I mean that looks like you answered all the questions. So I'm going to duck out
Cool.
and
All
let
right.
you take over with the screen share.
Very, very good. So let me go back to my PowerPoint because everybody loves PowerPoint. Okay. So isn't what we saw kind of like SCA? Eh, please. No, SCA is something entirely different. The first difference, I guess, once you start playing in the space for a while, the difference between these types of solutions become much more profound. But from the outside in, it may kind of look the same. Um, and that's kind of, I guess, kind of like my job to kind of educate. Number one is like inventory. SCA tools are not designed to identify accurate inventory. That's not their job. Their job is to identify risk. And most of the time, an SCA tool being close enough is usually good enough. But if you're a Boeing 787 and you're trying to analyze what happened, what software was in play during an incident, good enough is not going to cut it, right? Anything where public safety, national security, or any kind of other critical infrastructure, uh, good enough is not okay. So the difference between really SCA and SBOMs is SCA uses evidence to kind of formulate or guess what your inventory is. SBOMs actually assert what your inventory is. So it's different approaches. SCA tools can absolutely create an SBOM. That's a valid use case, right? There's one SCA vendor that I know of, or a couple of SCA vendors that I know of today that can actually generate SBOMs. But when I'm referring to SBOMs, I typically refer to the SBOM first approach, where you're actually generating SBOMs in your build pipeline. And the reason why that's important is that your SBOM can be progressively enhanced throughout your build pipeline. So if things can be augmented or corrected or added to, you end up with a much more complete, much more accurate software bill of material at the end if you actually take a little bit of extra effort and actually do that. You actually end up with much better results. The second difference really is around assemblies, right? We looked at that dashboard example, right? SCA most of the time has a really hard problem with doing this types of analysis where you have a thing that contains other things that contains other things. For example, Maven shaded plugins, right? If you have a shaded jar with other shaded jars, everything is shaded. What do I have? I don't know. SCA tools typically have a really hard time with that kind of software. Using a software bill of material approach, this is really elementary. It's really no big deal, shaded or not. Provenance is also a very big distinction between like SCA tools, how they work, and SBOM first tools like DependencyTrack. Most SCA tools, if they do provenance, can tie it to like maybe that thing that they got it from, or maybe that thing that originated from, right? But they won't actually catch the entire chain. And when we refer to provenance, right, it's really about that origin story. Who did I get it from? And possibly who did they get it from? And who did they get it from, right? So very elementary to do in software bill of materials, close to impossible to do with SCA tools, at least to that degree of accuracy anyway. Pedigree is also very difficult to do with SCA. It's you know, you can describe when we're talking about pedigree, we're talking about modified open source components, right? Open source is the ultimate supply chain. And organizations can and will modify open source components. They will, change them, they will rename them, they will redistribute them, and the chain continues, right? When we're referring to pedigree, that's what we're referring to, right? You have a component, and then you make some changes. And with software bill of materials, we can actually describe our new component, and then what that component originated from, and then what changes were made to make our version unique, right? You can't do that with SCA tools. In fact, the SCA tools will misidentify it most of the time. Packaging and distribution use cases. This really goes down to whether or not you are a cloud native company, or you're doing IoT devices, or you're doing like $30 million MRI machines, right? Packaging and distribution of software and being able to communicate what that is a prime example of why software bill of materials are so important. In fact, I think it was last week, there was an executive order for all federal agencies to adopt SBOMs. So this is now a federal requirement that we're going to have. Remediation and disclosure. Again, CycloneDX being the only security-focused bill of materials standard, but you can actually describe, for example, yeah, I might be using a vulnerable version of jQuery, right? But I've mitigated my risk, and my SBOM can actually describe my mitigations. How many of you have had customer interactions where a customer calls up or a business partner calls up and says, hey, I love your application, but you're using a vulnerable version of Angular, or you're a vulnerable version of this, fix it, right? Well, a software bill of material, if you give them that, it actually describes, yeah, you are using that vulnerable version, but it also describes your mitigating controls for that specific vulnerability. So it's a way that you can actually, it's a tool that you can actually use to for your help desk, really, to be able to de-escalate some of those types of calls. And you can also communicate disclosures themselves, right? You can actually describe the vulnerabilities that a specific component actually has. CycloneDX is a full stack SBOM standard, though, and hardware is supported. It's not supported all that well. There is an enhancement request to add better support for hardware, but hardware technically is supported. So if you do have that IoT toaster, you can actually describe the software that makes up that toaster. You can describe the processors, or the various other components that may reside in the Broadcom chips, for example, if you are into that. So you can describe all of that with CycloneDX. And finally, services, as we talked a little bit about. You can describe those REST API endpoints and other kinds of services in your software bill of material. What's really, really interesting to me is the ability for a software bill of material to have enough information to describe this. Now, if you are a security architect, you will immediately recognize this as a threat model. Well, what is this a threat model of? Well, on the left, it looks like my application is in a trust zone, and it looks like these are nothing more than external entities. By external entities are actually just software components or libraries. But then I've got this Acme stock library, and it has a dependency on the Acme stock service, which crosses a trust boundary. And I see that it requires authentication because a secret is required outbound. And it looks like public information, data classification goes outbound, and it looks like personally identifiable financial information comes inbound. So that's the kind of information that CycloneDX and DependencyTrack version 4.2 released yesterday. This is the type of thing that can be done today with a little bit of work, can be extracted from DependencyTrack, and you could automatically create this today. So yeah, Sbombs for the win. There's some really great use cases that software bill of materials have, and I think they're going to start playing a very important role now for the foreseeable future. There was a question on integrations earlier, and I'm glad that question was asked because as a flagship OWASP project, we try to pride ourselves with being able to integrate with as many things as possible. Software bill of material formats, Cyclone and SPDX. We work with a bunch of vulnerability intelligence platforms, and we're going to be, expanding that outwards as well. We have a bunch of different repositories that we support, the notification platforms, and of course the vulnerability intelligence or the vulnerability aggregation platforms that either are natively supported in DependencyTrack or that we know other vendors actually support, in their products, respectively. So here's some more information on DependencyTrack. Again, it's open source. The project is on GitHub. We're fairly active on Twitter. I really need to get some more videos out there, especially like short form, 5 minutes, how to do X. If you have ideas for like how to do X videos, drop us a note in the Slack channel. We actually have a really good Slack workspace. You can find the Slack workspace off of our website. But other than that, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking with the OWASP Nova today. So with that, any questions?
Yeah, certainly. So might end this on a slightly controversial one, but how does the vulnerability detection in DependencyTrack compare with DependencyCheck?
That's it. I get that asked all the time. Actually, that's a really great question. So DependencyCheck is absolutely an SCA tool, right? It uses evidence. I was one of the very first contributors that Jeremy had back in 2012, right? I think I told the story of that a while back. If anyone's interested, let me know. But DependencyCheck is absolutely an SCA tool. It looks at files on the file system to try to identify what those things are. And based on what that evidence is, it's going to do some fuzzy voodoo magic with the NVD to try to find some relevant vulnerabilities. And then, of course, there's all kinds of suppression filters based on top of that to kind of limit the noise, right? That's really the model. It also integrates with other sources of vulnerability intelligence, like OSS Index from Sonatype, for example. So there is some commonalities there. But there's a very, very different approach in the tools, right? These are not necessarily complementary tools. They look at the problem from two different and equally beneficial perspectives, right? One is not necessarily better than the other. They both have their place, right? I still use DependencyCheck, especially for things that I get where I might not know what this thing is. So yeah, literally the first tool I'll pull out of my toolbox is dependency check, just to be able to identify what this thing actually is.
Okay. And then looks like the last question is, what is your biggest hurdle within the project itself? Or any major roadblocks?
Wow. I think it's a matter of time. I think it's really interesting. You look at projects like Zap and really large community, and you look at their audience, and the audience for that is the ethical hacker, right? That's their audience, which is a little bit different audience than what DependencyTrack is aimed at. How DependencyTrack is actually aimed at is that risk and portfolio manager, or maybe that manager in AppSec, right? It's aimed a little bit higher on the corporate ladder, and because of that, I have found that the biggest hurdle for this project has really been getting active contributors. There's no problem getting adopters. I've got plenty and plenty of adopters, but getting contributors from those same organizations has definitely been problematic, just because we're higher up on that corporate ladder.
This is so there was one comment, but I'm going to try and reword it as a question. So, how could DependencyTrack handle issues like npm vuln takeover?
That's really interesting. One of the there's a couple different initiatives. Some of it led by OSSF, that is looking at project health, right? And that's something that is on the roadmap for DependencyTrack. It doesn't support it today. Being able to identify components that might have been tampered with is definitely on the short-term roadmap, right? So if I've got a component and Maven Central says it has this hash, but DependencyTrack says it has a different hash, that's something that we can identify in a future version of DependencyTrack. The project health aspect is a little bit more complex. It's a little bit more nuanced, but I would, for anyone looking for that type of issue, and by the way, that's not a new problem. It might be new to NPM, but this problem has been known for 13 or more years. The OWASP software component verification standard, I would highly recommend everybody checking that out. Level 1 is going to be really, really difficult for a lot of organizations to meet, but I really think it's going to be the minimum security bar that most organizations are going to be held to in the foreseeable future. With that, we're really talking about like hardening your build pipeline, making sure that change management is in place, right? Separation of duties for some of this change management, making sure that developers can't actually modify things outside of their immediate control of the source, for example. So it's really about maturing that build pipeline so that organizations don't become the next SolarWinds, right?
So Steve, I think I see some folks asking this question. So what's the best way to reach you? Is the DependencyTrack channel in the OWASP Slack? Is that the best way to reach you, or is there another way?
Yeah, the Slack channel is definitely the best. It's hash proj-dependencytrack, I think it is. So hit me up on the OWASP Slack workspace. Also, if you go to dependencytrack.org/Slack, it'll take you directly to that channel.
Perfect. So we can hang out here for another 30 seconds, give people a chance to digest all that, and see if there are any more questions. Because I know for me, this brought me back a couple of years to when I was doing enterprise security. So
yeah, it's definitely an ever evolving space, and it's definitely in the news a lot. So I think the project is really in an interesting place given all the world events that are happening in the wild. So I'm glad CycloneDX is where it's at today. I'm glad DependencyTrack is where it's at today, because it really does help organizations.
Okay, looks like we got one last question. What are some examples of automated decisions for those webhooks? So
Sure.
would it be possible to recognize that there is a critical vulnerability within a dependency? Could it then update to the latest version or do something along those lines?
You could actually, yeah, you could trigger any kind of action. So if something is out of date, for example, you can trigger an action. If you have a new vulnerability, right, like a new vulnerability on an existing component, you might want to trigger an action on that. Maybe that results in the creation of a JIRA ticket, for example, because it is an existing component, versus a new component that also has a vulnerability. Maybe that, in that case, you actually want to break the build, right? Maybe you want to, do a slap on the wrist to the developer in that particular case. So you can take different actions based on the type of event that occurred, and you also have like license events and other types of things as well. So if you want to treat your license violations a little bit different from your security violations, you can do that as well.
And yeah, I'm sorry, the questions keep rolling in. So
that's great. That's great.
You want to keep going? All right. So how does DependencyTrack compare to GitHub Dependabot?
Well, Dependabot really just updates your components, right? GitHub will tell you in some cases, what the vulnerabilities are, which is great. I'm glad GitHub actually does this. It doesn't do a very good job at it. I think the best value that Dependabot has is updating components, right? Getting that practice more and more accessible to people instead of an optional thing as kind of baked into GitHub itself, I think is a huge win. It doesn't actually impact DependencyCheck or DependencyTrack at all because it's a completely different use case. GitHub is very much focused on that repo, and their visibility is about that repo. They're not looking at this repo uses this repo and all these other things to actually construct a complex dependency graph that results in the creation of an application. They're not looking at that, right? You guys are building that every single day, though, in your organizations. You're building applications. So that's really what DependencyTrack is really aimed at. I would really love that to have GitHub actually support one of the SBOM standards instead of hopefully not creating the wheel and recreating something else. But if you do use GitHub, there are GitHub Actions for CycloneDX. So one of the things that the project is really focused on is automation, right? So there's implementations for for Maven and for NPM and PyPI or Python and just all kinds of different ecosystems, Rust and Ruby. But when you integrate with a build, that actually takes time. And if you've got 10,000 builds, that could be a lot of time. So I know SAP actually, the big software enterprise company, they actually have a Jenkins library that they use to automatically create SBOMs for all their Java projects, so they don't actually have to visit all their builds. Likewise, the CycloneDX project actually has GitHub Actions available for like 4 or 5 different ecosystems, so that you don't have to touch the builds. It's just part of your actual your software factory itself. So really accelerating the ability for organizations to quickly automate in mass as many of their software projects as possible.
All right. Yeah, so it looks like we have one last question, but it's a bit specific troubleshooting issues. So
okay.
No, there was one more about Defect Dojo. So Defect Dojo has an ASVS check. Could DependencyTrack push that to show pieces as a report?
That's a great question. I don't know. I know it reports on the vulnerabilities, but I don't know if it reports on anything else. I thankfully, that was one of the contributions that that were made to the project. So I haven't actually used it myself. I know the unit test passed though. But yeah, I would be glad to explore deeper integrations with like other OWASP projects like Defect Dojo, and I think there's a huge opportunity to start integrating with Zap as well, especially around DependencyTrack support for services.
Okay. Yeah. So for that specific question, I'm just sending them off to the Slack channel.
Right. Right. Yeah, Slack. There's a pretty active community of DependencyTrack adopters in the Slack workspace. So all kinds of people there that are willing to help.
Sure.
Yeah, I can attest to that. I've been there and asked questions and have had my questions answered. So
right on. Yeah, good.
Cool, cool. Well, yeah, again, if there are no more questions, or I guess, sorry, if there are any additional questions, just feel free to reach out to you, through Twitter, or the Slack channel would also be great, or if we need active mediums, please feel free to send an email to us. I'm more than happy to forward it along. But again, thank you so much for coming in and giving this SBOM talk.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
All right. And with that, thank you everyone for attending.
Thanks everyone. Appreciate it.
everyone.
All right.
Stay safe.
Bye.